Welcome. All right, so thanks everybody for being here today. For those who don't know me, my name is Kyle Schumann. I'm an assistant professor of architecture here at UVA. It's my absolute pleasure this evening to introduce David Levin and Stella Betts, principals of Levenbetts, a leading voice in architecture and design based in Manhattan. Levenbetts is recipient of countless design awards, including numerous state-level professional awards, national awards from the Society of American Registered Architects, the Chicago Athenaeum, the Architects newspaper, among many others. They were named Emerging Voices by the Architectural League of New York in 2009, held a prestigious MacDowell Fellowship, and in 2020 received the AAA New York State Firm of the Year Award, among perhaps the most competitive pool in the nation. Beyond their accomplishments as practitioners, David and Stella are prodigious academics. Stella is a senior critic at Yale. David is tenured faculty at Parsons. They've also taught at institutions including Cornell University, Syracuse University, Columbia University, and yours truly, the University of Virginia, not too long ago. One begins to wonder how they find time to do so much and at such a high level. Following the lecture, I welcome everyone on behalf of the school to join us for a reception and to view the exhibition, 13 American Houses, 9 City Blocks, 3 Wood Dwellings, just outside the lecture hall in the East Wing Gallery. The exhibition and the accompanying book, called 13 Ways of Looking at a House, are for me emblematic both of Levenbetts' holistic approach to design across scales, from the wall section to the house to the neighborhood to the city, but also of architecture's disciplinary capacities to transform how we live and what we expect of our built and natural environments. One of the first essays in the book recalls the idiosyncratic transformations to the everyday in the work of individuals like Alan Wexler, one of my personal favorite references, and Albert Frey in the Frey House 2, and the massive rock that cuts indiscriminately through the modernist systems of glass and steel and yet yields to an electrical outlet of all things. This sets up the need to understand, but also to critically analyze and question the fundamental assumptions of living and of architecture and its constituent elements, from the typologies of doors, windows, corridors, and stairs to larger tectonic assemblies. The text poses such questions as, how might a door that swings versus one that slides not only alter our patterns of use, but also present profoundly different opportunities for the choreography of domestic life? In this book, the exhibition, and across their body of work, Levenbetts subverts and transforms assumptions of everyday domestic life in such articulate ways that we might begin to question why we had ever lived in such ways at all. The practice achieves consistently what is becoming increasingly rare in the contemporary built work: the successful translation of clear spatial diagrams into materialized and constructed buildings. To the students in the room who, in your own studio projects, might have wondered how the clarity of a spatial partie diagram can negotiate the various demands of program, site, code, budget, and more, here you'll find a practice that is built around doing just that. The work demands an attention to detail and execution across scales, from the domestic to the urban, but also in modes of practice and representation, from the diagram to the drawings, models, and texts that frame the arguments inherent to each project and also enable their construction. Levenbetts presents a model of architectural practice and an argument for the agency of the discipline to which we can all aspire. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome David and Stella.
Thank you. That's very generous.
Hi, everybody. There's a lot of thanks that we'd like to give, but I really have to thank Kyle, because that was an amazing introduction, and he was just told 5 minutes before that he'd be doing that, so that was pretty remarkable. We want to thank Dean Mullo-Hudson, especially for inviting us, Ashley DeFallo, Saskia Santon, everybody who's eased our landing. The other Kyle, who I've heard is called the other Kyle, there he is, who the master of the pilot hole. And all things about pressure fitting, who who made sure that the show was installed and worked through the details with us so beautifully. And of course, Vishuddha and all the other students who worked on the show as well when I came down about a month ago to just sort of say, here it is. I don't know how we're putting it up. And that is actually the how we, not knowing how we put up is a big joke, because we, like anything that we do that has to do with building anything, we're fascinated by tectonics and the way things go together, and everything that that says and can tell you about design. So the mere installation of installing a show in your long, skinny gallery and making it twice as long and twice as skinny by running a spine down the middle became another exercise in how we put things together. We had great successes. We tried some experimental things. We had catastrophic failures. You may see some of the Band-Aids. We probably should have hired our mechanical engineer and a material scientist to understand density and airflow, but we didn't. But we had Kyle and the students. So thanks very much, all of you. Really appreciate it.
And just, we're going to talk a little bit, David's going to give an outline of what we're going to talk about today, which is mostly related to the exhibition with some a couple of new projects in there just for an added bonus. But what we like to do in our practice, and I think the book 13 Ways of Looking at a House is an example of that, is to do a deep dive into one aspect of our practice. So we're, in relation to the show, going to be talking about domestic space, houses and housing today. But actually a large part of our practice is in the public realm. We do a lot of libraries, some completed. We have 3 in construction. We're doing a renovation to the Queens Museum in New York, and also a new home for Aperture Foundation, a not-for-profit photography foundation in New York. So we're not going to be talking about those projects today. That'll be in a follow-up lecture in a couple of years where we will be doing a deep dive into libraries and probably a follow-up book. But today we're going to follow a little bit more to fill in some of the gaps or maybe connect some of the dots for the show itself.
Great. So the show, as hopefully you've seen it and had a chance to look through it, is sort of 2 shows in one and kind of 3 shows in one, since, as you know, and I always have to read this, the title being 13 American Houses, 9 City Blocks, 3 Wood Dwellings, and of course can be read crossways as well or diagonally, has these 3 components. The 13 American Houses comes from this book that we put together called 13 Ways of Looking at a House. 9 City Blocks is an urban study that we did in the city of Bentonville, Arkansas. We're going to talk a lot more about that. And then 3 Wood Dwellings are prototypes for aggregated housing in that larger urban plan.
And this project really started as House of Trees, City of Trees. We were asked by the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas, to do a pavilion that was based on housing. I think it was called something home. Now I can't remember. Coming Home, or anyway, we were a group of other architects to do a pavilion, and we also then did a research on the locale in Bentonville, which is what we're going to talk about. So that's sort of the City of Trees and House of Trees. And so we're going to start with that because a lot of our projects, and we'll show you one of our house projects, we often will have the privilege of doing a pavilion, and then that turns into a house. But so House of Trees, City of Trees, but starting with House of Trees at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, we were given a site amongst, I think, 4 other firms.
Right outside of the museum grounds, or actually on the grounds outside of the entry. And we, when we went on site, the first things that we're impressed by were these very tall trees, and in particular, the one single tall tree that you see in the middle, which is I'm not sure what kind of pine it is, but it's definitely a pine tree. And we wanted to incorporate that tree into the architecture to create this immediate conversation between building and nature.
And all the other sites were actually more open sites. So this one was the most challenging in the sense it was pretty dense with these trees, and we obviously didn't want to take any of them down because it was a temporary pavilion. So we mapped each one of the trees and then began to think about an open pavilion. That's the guy that's in the middle with his friends that are all orbiting around this pavilion. And I think the other thing that was important to us, which we're going to talk about with both, is that it was not only a pavilion that was in and amongst trees, so the experience of trees, and for that we're going to talk a lot about with our houses and housing, this sort of integration of landscape and nature and trees, but also with the domestic space. But also the pavilion was about using timber and local timber, which we're going to talk about.
So these are just a couple of images, initial studies of the pavilion, and we sort of boiled it all down to, within the mass timber that Stella was talking about, glue lambs, very deep glue lambs, 24 inches tall, which may look familiar to you. We'll get back to that. And CLT panels, cross-laminated timber panels. So this combination between something that could be, let's say, slatted and filtering light, and then something flat that might receive a shadow.
Mm-hmm. So, and then they aggregate around a kind of courtyard, an open courtyard. So this is the piece itself completed. So the tree in its location and the pavilion wrapping around it. And
all the pavilions played with this ruled surface, essentially, where the two plates, if you will, are at opposing angles, so that the glue lambs then create the implied curve as they move across. We then removed certain CLT panels, so removing the plate, and then place girders on top in order to hang the other glue lambs with these very skinny columns, just creating a whole series of structural, I want to say problems, but problems in a great way, things to be solved. So hanging girders versus bearing girders. So we work with our structural engineers a lot, not just in terms of solving problems, but finding the design potentials in the tectonics of supporting stuff. We love this. You'll see it throughout our work, and we're going to talk a lot about it today.
So this is, you may recognize this, the glue lamps. We've now recycled those, and they're supporting the models in the gallery space. So the material, when the show got taken down after 2 years, the material, some of it's still at Fay Jones School of Architecture, and then there's some pieces that we have and that we've been using as a base.
Right. This is essentially a traveling show, and you may be wondering why there's such large pieces of wood holding up such delicate models. And the reason is we had the material. We installed a show at the Fay Jones School of Architecture in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We were then fortunate enough to then bring the show here. And we're working really hard to find someplace else to take it because they're really heavy. And if we bring them back home, we really don't know what we're going to do with them.
So the second half of this project as part of the exhibition and the pavilion was City of Trees. And this was, again, part of the Crystal Bridges project, but we took on a kind of larger study where we wanted to take Bentonville, Arkansas as a case study and study it as a way to start thinking about the possibility for low density housing. And we're going to talk through that sort of research, which you've seen components, but again, I think this is where we can kind of connect some dots and fill in some gaps.
So we began by looking at Northwest Arkansas, the cities that you see here sort of in the white blotchy forms of Fayetteville, Bentonville, and Rogers, Arkansas, that Rogers kind of wraps around this lake that you're going to see in a moment. Arkansas is bounded on the east side by the Mississippi River. Northwest Arkansas is obviously on the other side. And to the south is a whole ton of forests. They used to be owned by Weyerhaeuser, and they made paper. They've been acquired by other lumber conglomerates, global conglomerates who are sort of moving lumber around the planet.
I think that was supposed to hit, oh no.
Don't turn everything off. But
I thought she said that, well.
What we based the project in was the supply chain of taking timber from Arkansas, turning it into lumber in Arkansas, and bringing it to the site at the Crystal Bridges Museum. So it was a supply chain study as well. And if you think that's easy, it's not. If you want to control your supply chain in a project, it's not what architects can do. It's not what is part of what we do. When we do try it, you learn a lot about the movement of materials and all the different things.
But it was as much, I mean, this tied into both which we're going to show you, the housing proposal, but also the pavilion itself, which David's talking about. And that was as much a part of the project, if not more, sourcing the timber locally and having it fabricated locally. And really, we were, if we think about the carbon footprint of the project, we were the weakest link coming from New York. And so everything else we wanted to be local.
But for students, it's an important lesson for us to impart, which is that when you go into the field and you're working, your responsibilities to reduce carbon, which we've just now tasked you with, is to understand the supply chains. If you think you're going to get it perfect, you won't. Global supply is so complex, and certain assumptions that you'll make will be upended. However, when understanding the materials they're using at any level and for any reason, it's incumbent upon us as designers to dig deeply and to understand the materials that we're using.
So back to the urban.
Back to the urban.
Okay.
This is Bentonville, Fayetteville, this corridor that you're seeing here. Rogers is the sort of dragon-y shaped lake on the right side. And the larger kind of urban agglomeration of Bentonville is here with what was called the Third Historic Ward in the middle, which we found to be really interesting. It's sort of a urban, but like a single-family house urbanity, very low single-family house on single-family lot that we're going to talk a lot about here.
So,
and here it is.
Yeah, so kind of looking at that typical American sort of suburban sprawl and how it related to this particular locale. So you probably know from the video that's in the hallway, we really documented this area of Bentonville and identified both the sort of more vernacular, the current vernacular and of this region, and then looking at what's then starting to get built. So this was a crazy thing that happened while we were doing the research. We started to do a research in 2020, I guess, because the show went up in like 2022. And what was amazing is we were trying to familiarize ourselves before we came to the site. So prior to our site visit of just looking at street view and map view. And we kept getting confused because we would look at the map view, which is on the right, with the color coding, that would show these much larger houses that were on these lots compared to then the street view, which was showing still these much smaller scaled cottages type houses. And what we realized is that the development in this area was happening so fast that street view wasn't caught up to the maps view. And that really indicated to us too how, the zoning that had changed just in a short period of time, how rapidly it was starting to change this neighborhood. So we were really looking at, this particular district, the residential zone 1, but seeing like a single family house on a single lot. And then what was happening on the right is then these very, very large houses that were being built. So you know what that means, right? It's slowly becoming unaffordable to be in this area of downtown Bentonville, which is in walking distance to the sort of center of Bentonville.
And the city's also been growing kind of very quickly. If you don't know what Bentonville means or was started by, it's the Walmart. It's the Walton family that started Walmart. So there's a lot of economic pressures. It's an incredible center of wealth in what's largely a not wealthy state.
And they also, that's the Crystal Bridges Museum is part of the Walton family.
Yeah.
So what we started to look at is looking at the single family lot on the left, where as the houses get bigger, the sort of cost grows. And we started to speculate a different type of zoning configuration where you could take those same 3 lots, but once you combine them, could you begin to think about a higher density, still low density in terms of the sort of urban context, but where you begin to have different family configurations and densities that occur.
And one of the things that we studied also is the kind of, where this settlement pattern of the single lot and the single house comes from. It's a European model of land ownership. We had looked at the Osage peoples who had inhabited this landscape before, who were semi-nomadic, farming and foraging and hunting, who clearly had a very different conception of, let's say, ownership or non-ownership of the land. So we obviously couldn't propose that we would make a forager society in this landscape. However, we were interested in challenging this, and we thought about how could we perhaps start to, mix this up and also mix up concepts of ownership using land trust models of overall aggregated lot, block, and parcel ownership counter to single family, single lot.
So, and then one of the things we did is we looked in this third historic district that David was talking about. We kind of started to look for opportunities, empty lots. We also found there were some very interesting sort of alleyways that were not official roadways, but that, because of course if you start to combine lots and you aggregate, you have to think of ways that people can get to their unit, both vehicularly and other access, even for like emergency. So we found this crazy opportunity where there were these alleyways essentially that we could then utilize if we started thinking about a new zoning configuration for aggregating.
And so alleyways are obviously mid-block. They're not on this sort of this street structure that is, quote unquote, controlled. They're perhaps more free in a way. They might provide more opportunities for discovery, let's say.
So we took those videos and tons of photographs and began to kind of map the neighborhood and find opportunities where there are these open lots. Simultaneously, we were also just looking at different family structures, right? We're in a different place. The idea of the sort of single family home and a kind of traditional family structure is not the way we necessarily live now. So we were also looking at different types of structures that could exist, and also just looking at the expected growth in Bentonville, that for their projections for 2035, and just understanding then the need that was coming. Then we also just looked at these, at the vernacular houses, just looking at the single pen, the central hall, the 2-story, the dog trot, and just kind of a way to understand what some of the local architectural tradition was. And then we began to kind of think about prototypes. And these models are about these prototypes.
So we went through a whole modeling study of, how could we kind of develop something that, started to get at these ideas of co-housing, perhaps, the singular, the aggregated, the combined into multiples, also in a hot climate, like in Arkansas, making things very tall to draw cross ventilation up through the building. The courtyard typology was something we thought would be interesting in combination with these airflow ideas. And then, of course, composition. How do we apply design ideas to this?
So a lot of these are really looking at sort of, a riff on the porch or a kind of interpretation of the dog trot house. And so a lot of the sort of porosity and an idea of a sort of courtyard scheme. And then also, which we'll show you when we look back at the sort of urban aggregation, the sort of challenging of the sort of front and rear yards. So we did a whole series of models studying this sort of aggregation. And then this was a really important thing to us. We often look outside of architecture for our sort of, not just inspiration, but just as a way to kind of understand space making. And so these paintings by Joseph Albers, a sort of homage to the square, we became really interested in this layering of potentially interpreting these as either public-private, interior-exterior, whether these are porches or sort of layers in this type of climate, or whether in the case like with any one of these, if the central square becomes a courtyard, and how we would potentially assemble domestic space around it.
And then also looking at Kazimir Malevich and the way Malevich uses composition to address the space of the canvas, which has just a huge influence on us. You'll even see in the show, there are 13 models of sites of the houses that we're going to show in a moment. And the very act of placing a model in an 18-inch by 18-inch square is an act of design that mirrors the act of siting of a building and deciding where a building goes on a site and why.
Yeah, and so these two examples of these artists were also just about thinking, if you think about the canvas as a site, And so we started to become interested in not only the Albers in terms of the sort of square and the possibility of a courtyard reading, but then with the Malevich, we were interested in just the sort of like the object and its relationship to the canvas as a site, right? If it's either centered or off-centered, or if it divides it into quadrants. So we started to take that as an interpretation, even as a way to help us think about a variation of space types, but also like some kind of system or pattern, right? So there's something consistent. It's not completely arbitrary, but it's also working within something that allows for playfulness and variation. Because if you're thinking about housing, it's important to also feel like your house is different than other houses.
So the Albers-Malevich mashup turned into a site planning strategy for one of the larger sites within the 9 blocks that we're going to show you.
And so we'll kind of pull this apart, because this was sort of a prototypical
We had a great time.
aggregation. But and we're, one of the things which we're going to talk about is it's, again, not about single lots. This is an aggregation. So this sort of even front and rear yard, it's kind of a communal rear yard.
So go back one. So we're going to show this a little bit more. You'll see.
I'm trying.
Oh no, it's going to jump.
There it goes.
So you'll see the space. The space is inside the houses in terms of courtyards, but then also the space inside the block as let's say private to a house versus public, in an inversion of where a yard may be and what a yard is and how it's used. So in these prototypes of aggregated components, beginning with the square inside the square, we started to look at how single families, however they're defined, become sort of, they're separated, but the unit as an aggregated component gets put together, and then that forms an architecture. And the two on the left here are two different ways of doing that within this system, and the model on the right is a full-on co-housing concept where people have individual rooms clustered around tree courtyards and then large communal spaces running all the way through the building and connecting to the street and then back into that courtyard that you saw in the middle of the block.
So then we continue to sort of make models now that are very similar to the original study ones, but a little bit more specific, and starting to think about thicknesses of walls and floors and roofs. But still you can see, like especially the image on the right, that upper porch, ideas of like covered porch and breezeways and courtyards, inserting now the tree, because we're really, bringing back that concept from the pavilion and the urban. You want me to go back?
Go back one. Yeah. One of the things that we love to do in our models is to use our model making methods to kind of to work as a feedback loop where we begin to consider construction systems. We're going to talk about this in a moment, but the construction system that we were playing with, learning about when we were doing this project had to do with primarily with cross-laminated timber panels, like you saw in the pavilion, coupled with glue lams for longer spans. Since kind of working through that, and we're working on this on a couple of different projects in our office right now, the kind of reliance on CLT, we began to think, it's a little too far it's a little too expensive, quite frankly, and it's too much of a usage of material. So hybrid systems where perhaps some CLT were needed for shear, glue lams needed for span, but
even traditional stick framing and
stick framing or deep, let's say straw insulated or cellulose insulated panels where one didn't need either shear or gravity would be a lot more efficient and would even sequester a lot more carbon.
Right.
So in this model, you can see the ideas of where the CLTs are, but then also the sort of furring systems where airflow would occur between the structure and the rain screen.
And so you see that in the structure, but really in the section, but I think the drawing
that one sticks too, yeah. So the airflow from the courtyard up through the building, through stairwells, through open spaces, up into this very tall second story space. So all the houses had this sort of pointy little fairly large second floor space, kind of a wonderful space to be in. And then this component diagram speaks of the sort of the CLT panel system. We even just ran this by our structural engineer in terms of orientation of planks, length, maximum lengths versus typical widths of panels, where glue lambs are used, the types of foundations, which are much shallower in Arkansas than where we were used to working in New York State in residential projects, and roof and fenestration systems.
So, and then these are just the sort of final renderings or versions of this aggregation, which we'll show again in terms of the specificity of where they're located. But you see the interlocking, the idea of even shifting these off one another. We're going to talk a lot about variation of entry points so that it's not just front and back, but multiple points that allow for individual experience of your unit. So these are just, again, the sort of images of the aggregation of these units, and you can see the sort of entry porches and the upper level porches that take advantage of that cross ventilation with the courtyard. And this is a really important point, and we're going to look at the site plan in a moment. But then what's traditionally a rear yard, but again, we've eliminated the individual lots. So this is a sort of common rear communal garden. So, you know, that is all shared by these units. So it's a semi-private space. So it's that we'll talk about it when we see the urban diagram. So again, just
So it went
going
from the single to the double, and then from the double to the multiple, let's say, aggregated. And across the 9 blocks in Bentonville, what you're going to see, here's the core, there's the 3rd Historic District, the teeny piece in the middle, and there's the model that you may have seen in the video. You know, there are opportunities for larger aggregations like you're seeing in the upper left-hand corner, like let's say a couple in a few other areas, little singles here and there as we just sort of cruised around the neighborhood to see where the opportunities may be.
We'll go through these a little bit quicker because I think some of these are part of the show. So these were outtakes from the video, but again, sort of mapping that neighborhood and then ultimately kind of assessing and measuring like what are we adding in terms of new housing units, shared courtyards, vegetable gardens, green roofs, markets, daycare, fitness, community centers, parking with permeable paving and ice cream parlors, et cetera. The idea is that there's a kind of a social network of program that is shared within these units. So the idea was...
Sorry to interrupt you. It goes beyond the functionality of you live in a house here and you go shop somewhere else. Or you have services somewhere else. You know, the contention was you could mix up the zoning of the lots and the blocks. You should also be mixing up programming so that people have greater access, which enables child rearing, the kind of the elderly living in these communities because they have much less distance to go for services.
So again, you can see the greater density. This is the model that's in the corridor taken between those 9 blocks. And then these are just outtakes of 3 of them, just looking at what that result is of adding this slightly greater density and what we're adding to these different blocks within the neighborhood. We won't go into these in detail because I think we should move on. But and as you probably saw in the video, this is sort of literally we were swapping out. These are like puzzle pieces on a magnet, and we were able to sort of swap these out and then look at this aggregation. That again, you can see the sort of common rear yard and then the different entry points, the different patio entry points that allows for access, but also creates variation. Do you want to talk about the? And
there's just the ground floor site plan that you've probably seen hanging in the gallery. Where the sort of vibrance of gardens, communal gardens, spaces to hang out in and amongst the buildings is, let's say, as important, as equal weight as the design of the units themselves. There are housing, laundry, gyms, greenhouses, all types of programs that were considered and are actually drawn into that.
And then, again, the different entry points. So it's not all frontal, that there are ways because of the shifting that you can enter your unit off of the side. And then this sort of rear yard that's this communal space was part of the idea of all of this. And then the interior where you sort of see from inside to outside to inside to outside, which you're going to see comes up a lot in our houses. So we're going to jump over now to the complement to this in terms of a deep dive into, we've designed and built 13 houses, and actually we're going to show you 2 new ones. One that was at the very end of the book that was still under construction, and we're sharing photos
So
for the first
we'll
time.
go quickly through the ones that are in the show because you can see those.
Yeah.
And we'll talk to you about the ones that are new and exciting to us.
So as David
Not the
already
old ones,
mentioned,
obviously.
the whole idea was there's not really one way to kind of design a house. It has to do with site, it has to do with climate, it has to do with materiality. So this idea of comparing 13 houses, comparing 13 sites, that all the same site model, but looking at the topography and the relationship of the house to the site was an important aspect of the book. And Kyle already talked about there are different essays that kind of take the house apart, doors, windows, steps and stairs, structure, house plants, which have to do with nature, were all part of this comparison of these 13 houses.
This is just a comparison of the houses. You can see from the very, very tiny in the middle to the largest house that we ever designed right next to it. It's just fascinating to see the scales of occupation that you can take on as an architect. These images are from a series in the book and an essay called Thick and Thin that have to do with the different types of the different wall sections, essentially, the way we build, the materials that we build with, the many layers that we build with, or the very few layers that are quite thick. We're fascinated by what that means for the design, the feeling, the kind of capacities of the house thermally, as well as the details that then come out of these. So these are the drawings in the show.
So these are the 13 houses. Each house gets one kind of example of its wall section, and then we're going to quickly go through 3 of them and then kind of pair them so that you can, which they're paired in the book, but you can see as well. So again, we're going to go through the first 3 quite quickly. They're in the book. You may already be familiar with them, so we're not going to go at length. The first one is Square House, and we're going to talk a little bit more just about the materiality of these different houses. This is all cast in place concrete, so the board forming was really critical. It came out of, which we're going to show you, the process of the model making. This sits very much into the ground. It's very heavy. Some of our other houses are much lighter. You can see that when we did the Arkansas analysis, it probably wasn't the first time that we were looking at Albers and the square, so you can see some of that same fascination and obsession that we have. So this is really a planimetric diagram of the house. One of the things that I think we're really interested in is in the informality of a lot of these houses, where you can enter them from any room. So this house actually doesn't privilege one side or another. You can enter from any facade, and because it's a square, there isn't sort of one that's more important than the other. And this is
part of Thick and Thin, where we on the drawing on your right. Is the detail that's in the wall section. And we had a lot of fun just sort of devising our own hatches, let's say, for the different materials in order to kind of create an expressive representation. We're fascinated by modes of representation, as you can tell, and we wanted to kind of dig into what is in those thick and or thin walls.
So it's concrete board formed concrete, but then with a wood roof. So here are the roof plans. But one of the things that's interesting, just as students, what we were, this might be relevant for you, is that, we started by layering chipboard, and we got fascinated by those layers, and then it actually really did inform the project, and then we cast the second round of the models of the house, and that really then became the house. It wasn't something that we started with, it's something that came out of the process of iterating different model types. And here you see each facade has its own entry point, so we're not privileging one or the other, even the bathrooms.
So the chipboard was first a positive, and then it became a negative, so that we could cast against it, and then it turned into concrete, and then became the positive that then required a different negative in order to form it.
Right. And so this idea of, even the bedrooms, everything, every door, every area that we think is a window is actually a door, including in one of the bathrooms, and then stairs that go up to the roof. And then, having concrete be both an interior and exterior material as much as possible. But then where you see up at the ceiling where that was wood framing, then that is sort of plaster and sheetrock. House of One Shape came out of, actually, this is a house up in Hudson. This came out of another pavilion that we did that was based on a right trapezoid that was called Zoid. And we were designing the house at the same time that we were building this pavilion. And here's another sort of obsession with the courtyard. So a lot of times we use the pavilions as a way to sort of think through the project. This is the diagram of this house, a series of right trapezoids that mirror and nest, and each one is a different room. So there's an outdoor sort of patio, a kitchen, a living or dining, and another patio. It's very much about kind of an interior and exterior relationship. And here again is the thick and thin.
Right. With
This is a wood structure with stucco. Yeah.
It's all wood. There is no steel in this house. The second floor has a second layer for both airflow to the upper floor, meaning HVAC, as well as to accommodate a planted roof and the sliding doors going right out to it. So you have to get high in order to keep things low and waterproof.
Yeah. So this house as a stucco on the outside, but as David said, it's all wood framing. And it also is lighter. It sits on the landscape lighter. It sits a little bit up, so it's sort of as opposed to the square house that's at into the ground. These are also additional models. And
the house also, it's, as Stella said, it's a series of right trapezoids, and then has a parallelogram on the roof that you can see in this image here that touches down on the structural points of the right trapezoids below, with a stair coming up in the middle that then creates two triangular rooms. So there's sort of a series of geometric calibrations, manipulations going on in the house that create idiosyncratic spaces.
Yeah.
The fun of that event, of course, is going from these concrete models into actual usable and pleasant domestic space.
right. And you can see these plans in the book or even in the exhibition. So we're not going in too much detail. But the idea was also to sort of, we liked having the whole interior be lined with plywood, and only the areas that are wet or exterior, or where in the case of the fireplace had a cement board, but otherwise everything, wall, floors, and ceiling were plywood, and then just the openings of the right trapezoid for each space. House Without Walls is in Hillsdale, New York. This was very much about a theme of sort of a pavilion. A lot of these projects are, and we're going to talk about that in some newer projects that we're going to share with you. So really thinking about what's the most reduced form of kind of domestic space is just, shelter, right? A roof and columns. And so we thought of this roof with the columns in a series of volumes that ended up just being either bathrooms or closets or kitchen, that then kind of had a loose pattern. Was sort of like a Mondrian, a painting that where you sort of get the different marks, in this case the different volumes at 90 degrees in this sort of open pattern. So it doesn't, we said it's a house without walls because it's really just crates or volumes, but no singular like sheetrock wall.
So the material is the same on all sides.
And it allows
so
the
you'll see
material to be the same on the inside, the outside. It just looks like a series of boxes under a roof. So you can see that in the plans and the site plan. In this case, here's the thick and thin drawings. This
It also
had some-
accommodated a gutter system, a very skinny roof for the patio covering against the thicker insulated roof. The plants, we refer to this as the sponge on top. The sort of, with the addition of the plants, there's sort of an R value that's incalculable past just the insulation. I suppose we could calculate the soil, but the inspector would not allow that.
or wouldn't take it in consideration, which is unfortunate.
Which is fine, because we met code.
So-
We exceeded code.
So the diagram was about this roof, and there were skylights that were both inside and outside, so again, not really differentiating between exterior and interior, and the series of columns. Oh, you want to go back?
But the
Sorry.
columns also, just going back to those initial ideas we were talking about in the House of Trees pavilion, where with the sort of the structural, using structural tech and the tectonics, the expressive nature of structure as design drivers and as design inspiration here. We just love these ideas of these pavilions being held up with these skinny columns. Everything in order to make that happen has to happen in the roof, and it has to happen in the ground. So we're resolving those forces above and below. And kind of deciding what we're showing and what we're not showing. So in this case, to not express, let's say, where those connections are made in order to prioritize the space, and the kind of the movement of the columns around those patio spaces, much like you would feel when you're walking through a forest with tall, very tall trees.
Right. And there's going to be a relationship to that with a new project that we're going to show you. So as you can see, we do a lot of model making as a way to kind of understand that process. And you see the sort of aggregation of skylights. Some are completely open holes. Some are skylights that are glass skylights, but in exterior spaces. And then some are skylights over. So we really like the idea of this roof is both covering interior and exterior spaces.
So you're seeing the patio roof as the overhang here, but wherever you see the plants,
that's the conditioned space.
Rectangle, that's the conditioned space. So using that as the insulation, which allows us at the patio to keep it very, very thin, so that from when you view the building, you're perceptibly, it looks like an incredibly thin roof.
Which you see on the image on the left.
Yeah.
And then on the image on the right, you see a little bit
back
more
to
of
the
that.
thickness
You see
where
more
the
of that
overhang
sponge.
is less. Yeah.
So here you actually see this is taken a little bit higher up. It's the back side of the house where there's not a covered patio, and you see that planted roof. So as part of that, which we have used in several of these houses, as David said, as a type of insulation. And then just really bringing nature as much as possible. Here you see there's the hole in the roof on the upper right-hand image as part of that courtyard. So that's not
but
a
also
skylight.
seeing the outdoor, the material outside is identical to the material on the inside, so that these boxes read as discrete elements that are pivoting at 90 degrees to one another, infilled either by glass or space.
No walls. So now we're going to just show you really quickly two new projects. One is, we're calling it 3+1 ways of looking at a pavilion. So it's kind of continuing this conversation we just had with the last project. The first one is actually in addition to one of the first houses we did, which was this house that's in the book. And we're not going to talk about this house, but the clients had then come to us and asked us to create three new structures: a garage, a studio, and a pool house with a pool. And so three separate structures. And so this became for us an opportunity. When do you get to do sort of three somewhat similarly scaled but different program? So we started thinking about three different ideas of a pavilion. So these
And
are
the idea is there's enclosed spaces that you see, enclosed conditioned spaces that you see in black against spaces that are enclosed by glass that are also conditioned, that you see with the light lines around the outside. And then the lines around the outside of the outside are the roof extensions with trees in holes in the curved shapes inside the outside.
You'll see. So this is the site plan. You're going to probably have to point. Oh, wait, we got a laser.
Oh, yeah. Dick
Sorry.
set us up with that. We have to thank Dick Smith for his help on the show.
Wait, maybe. I don't remember where it is.
Here.
I don't remember. Okay, so
All right.
that's the original house. So the original house is here, and that house is in the book. But then we have three pavilions that we've added: a garage, and then a studio, and then a pool and pool house. Right. So we're going to go through each one, and they're each a pavilion. So these are the top was the garage, the middle was the study for the studio, and the bottom is the pool house. So we were just looking at these different pavilions with a very similar concept: a very thin, flat roof, thin columns, and then some kind of conditioned space that sits underneath that gives you also a protected, sheltered space.
So similar to the last house where you saw the kind of, the columns, the skinny white columns holding up the roof. These are, and those were circles. These are squares and rectangles, and I'll get to that in a moment. All of the columns are most of the columns are pulled to the perimeter. So all the buildings have columns at the perimeter, which is a very different structural condition than floating a roof with columns pulled in from the edges that then have certain degrees of cantilever. There are no cantilevers at all in these. However, because the columns are so skinny, some had to be rectangular to resist certain lateral forces, and most were 2.5-inch squares that were supporting the roof and tied into foundations and roofs.
So sometimes we we've worked with the same engineer on most of these houses, and sometimes we'll say it's really important for us that every single column is the exact same dimension, and that's really hard because at different areas of the house, it's taking on different forces. And then other times, like with these pavilions, we're like, no, it's okay that you might recognize that all of a sudden there's a column that has a greater depth in one dimension, because then it's a little bit didactic. It's subtle, but if you notice it, in this case, we thought that we sort of celebrated that difference. And other times,
that at 36 at the Y-shaped house, the largest house in that lineup, where all the columns had to be the same, and like literally one column then drove the size of all the other columns, and I've never stopped regretting it. So we keep, we'll
we do stuff and then we change our mind.
And then it was like, why did we do that?
So we'll go through each
kids.
pavilion quickly, and we're going to show you construction photos that are only like 2 weeks old. So this is the garage. It's the housing the one car, and then the rest is a roof supported by columns, and then there's a car that can be as a carport, and then there's a hole with a tree. These are the renderings, so you see the sort of volume of the garage itself, steps going up because it sits within a section, and then a kind of open carport, patio, or a place for bikes. And then this hole with this trees, you can see our obsession with trees being as part of the project. So I was noting the section. This is kind of looking at it from another view where the roof is very thin, and these are the construction photos. So this is the exact same image where at some points, because the landscape of the whole site, these pavilions are in different locations, the garage is the lowest. So when you're up at an upper level of the other pavilion, you see the roof like this, which is what you see here in construction. So go ahead.
But you'll also see on the right side is the garage, the enclosed garage that is made up of concrete walls, very, very structurally stable, versus as you get farther out to the left and the columns start to get, they get farther out, but they also cluster a little bit more together in order to kind of help one another out and to resolve the lateral forces. Because once the roof gets all the way out there, it wants to start swinging like a sail in the wind.
Right.
So once again, the way the columns are tied into the ground and the foundation,
you can see it.
and the and the roof structure is critically important. We tend to drive the contractors crazy. But it can't be done any other way, because if it's not done exactly per engineering, the roof's going to fly away.
So you see then the hole with the tree, the fascia isn't on yet, but you can see that this kind of carport area that's looking towards the garage is a large open area. And as David said, it actually can very easily turn into a sail. So tying this down is actually, uplift is a big challenge for
You're
a
also
pavilion
seeing
like this.
3 rectangles at the edge versus a series of squares that are closer to the concrete of the
Oh,
garage.
sorry. Yep.
No,
So then going to the studio, which is the sort of middle one and adjacent to the existing house, this has a kind of central area that has infrastructure for bathing and mechanicals, and then an office, what's shown on the right-hand side, and an open studio, which actually now it doesn't have the Murphy bed. It's more of an open studio space. Do you want to talk a little bit? This is very similar to what you were just talking about with the house with no walls in terms
Right.
of
So,
these details.
all the details that incorporate the wood framing, 2x8s. I don't think anything is bigger than a 2x8 in the roofs, in order to keep those roofs as skinny as possible. They always get thicker than you want them to. And so we either accept that and we detail for it, or we play, like in the house without walls, the kind of sleight of hand game where you make it very skinny, but perspectively you don't see up to the thicker roof.
But we couldn't do that here because you see these roofs at different levels. But also we had an opportunity because in most areas of these roofs, we don't need to worry about insulation, certainly not for the garage.
But we spend a lot of time on how these columns are also bolted into the foundation. We spend a lot of time with the engineer determining where the rebar is, and we spend a lot of time with the contractor telling them to move the rebar because it often goes in the wrong place and needs to kind of be put in the exact right place in order to tie in with the bolts that are coming from the bolt plates and the columns up above. So this is all happening beforehand, and it's critically important that we are on site and part of that process. with the construction.
So this is, again, these are renderings of the studio. So this side is very blank with the sort of concrete wall. There's also a play of heavy and light here in terms of the lightness of the roof. And then this is the view of the studio space. And here it is in construction again. The glazing going in, the fascia's not in yet. You see the tree. It's not springtime yet. You guys are much closer to getting to springtime than we are. This is the view from the original house. House of Lines, I think it was, and again the tree, and then looking towards the studio space.
Just to note, these all of these houses that we're showing are in the Hudson Valley, so they're 2 hours north of New York City. Obviously, we're in a similar climate along the northeast, but it's a little bit more severe climate, so our frost steps are lower.
Just trees going in. Yeah. And then the third pavilion is the pool house. Again, the sort of conditioned space is the volume on the right that has bathrooms, a small kitchenette, and like a living area, and then a large open patio, outdoor dining area, and again with the hole with the tree. So these are similar details. I don't think we need to go through them. Here are the renderings. This is kind of looking from the original house down, so you sort of have the privacy and the pools on the other side. And then this is the sort of open side, as if you were in the pool looking back at the pavilion. So you have an interior space on the right, a covered space for outside dining in the middle, and then the open area with the tree. So here again, you see the pavilion, and you can kind of see that it sits lower. And then you see the studio pavilion a little bit off to the right. And again, just looking at these openings, each one gets a tree as part of that outdoor space. And then these last slides are just showing the relationship of these pavilions. You start to see the change in the topography and the section, so the relationship of each one of these. This is looking at the garage that then, as you saw in that section, is when it had that sliver with just the hovering roof, is when you're kind of in that in-between space. And then the studio is up the hill a little bit on the right.
So the whole project will be really this, kind of perception of a building from being within a building or outside of it, and seeing the other buildings also in relation to the original house.
Exactly. And there's the original house, and then you sort of see that's the pool house.
So the original house was a series of kind of more vertically oriented volumes sliding up alongside of one another, whereas all of these buildings are low and horizontal.
So last one, really quickly, this was at the very end of the book. It was under construction. It's a house with a swerve that's recently completed, and this first time we're kind of sharing the photos.
This is our longest and thinnest house. It's 165 feet long and no wider than 16 feet at any point. In fact, it's always consistently 16 feet wide outside.
The diagram here is, starting at the top, is an outdoor covered patio. The black zone is the area of conditioned space. Then the middle patio, sort of like the dog trot house, is an open sort of breezeway. We shift the building in the two volumes there to create a swerve, but more importantly, to mitigate this sort of relentlessness of a very, very long house. And then you get another set of rooms with a study and another bathroom. It's an indoor space in black, and then another outdoor space. Usually from top to bottom, you're like outdoor, indoor, outdoor, indoor, outdoor.
And this has a lot to do with, I think we talked about this idea of an open house. And that's one of the chapters in the book about the 13 ways, where we talk about what open means. It's not just windows. It's really a consciousness. It's living with one's surroundings. It's non-hierarchical. It's multiple ways of entry. And these buildings that we're talking about, they're all very like pavilion-like. They incorporate the outdoors very, very integrally with the overall organizations, essentially. So like Estella said, outdoor, indoor, outdoor, indoor, outdoor. Those are really important organizations for the way we think about buildings.
So you see, again, this sort of play on this.
Sometimes you get cold when you walk outside.
So here the columns are sort of actually moving where they need to be. There's not really a kind of, they're not on the edge and they're not on a grid in the center. They're sort of drifting based on what the sort of needs were from a structural standpoint. So this is actually in that sort of breezeway area.
And we thought about, do we want to like make that a clear span all the way across? Go back to that.
Yep.
And we actually really loved just, once again, using 2x8 wood framing in that roof and a couple of skinny columns, and that's all we needed. So we actually decided to celebrate it as opposed to going for this sort of heroic span, which requires steel. So for economies and for expressiveness, let's say, we really enjoyed using the columns. We've had other architects come and say, like, oh, it should have been a clear span. In fact, Stephen Hall came to the house. He's like, oh, yeah, why'd you do that? And we're like, because it's cool, Stephen.
So again, the models, and also looking, in this case, doing cedar siding in vertical strips. And so in certain cases, the siding is pulled apart to create sort of like a screen-like effect. So this is the end patio that is open to that second volume, and then you see the shift of the swerve. And we can go through this quickly, but we don't, when we do these houses, we go through a whole series of environmental analysis, just like you do in studio, looking at predominant winds, looking at orientation. This house is actually, for all intents and purposes, off the grid. It's geothermal heating and cooling with its own solar panel that articulates. So this house.
So the panel operates the pumps,
right,
that then heats the house.
Right. So no fossil fuels for heating and cooling. It's all electric, and then it's generated.
The walls are also a little bit extra wide in terms of their framing. It's still conventional stick framing, but we don't even actually use continuous insulation. They're just wider, thicker walls with more insulation in them. Again, just efficiencies. How efficiently, let's say, could we build the wall section?
So here, just other images of the house, but just talking about this sort of materiality. Again, all of these houses, it really is about its siding. This doesn't have a tree in the house, but actually a lot of the swerve not only came from mitigating the sort of length, but there are these two amazing, three trees that right near the house, and we placed the house as close as we could in proximity to those trees, which you actually saw probably in here, like very, very close. So it's very much about a house.
At the end, it's the last one.
Oh, it's coming.
Yeah.
So here's that image of the sort of end patio. So again, the sort of outside, inside, outside.
But also
inside.
You're seeing in this image, the land has sloped down about 30 inches. And then, so this patio becomes lower, there are steps down to it, and the tall, skinny column becomes even taller and skinnier, or no, taller, it's the same skinny.
And some of the interior spaces that then, it's a very narrow house, but by having floor to ceiling glass, it has an openness to it, and it's very much about obviously seeing and framing the trees and being sort of open to the landscape.
And the interiors are the concrete slab that uses radiant heat driven by the geothermal system, but also all of the walls are lime plaster with no plasticizers. So the house, and so there's no paint on the walls as well. The color is integral. The plaster is its own thick troweled surface. It breathes. It cleans the air. It's kind of a phenomenal surface that operates directly against the use of sheetrock. And we often obviously paint with latex paint, which is simply plastic. So we're really getting away from putting plastic in our buildings that makes us sick.
And then these are just some of the other exterior images of that other sort of outdoor living space. All of these houses are very, very small, with the exception of that one that David was talking about, which is the three-pronged house in the book. But generally, these are all under 2,000 square feet or around 2,000 square feet, but really utilizing the outdoor space as much as possible. This really becomes like a living room, and that really makes the houses feel a lot bigger. That's that relationship to that. And then also just looking at the flexibility of some of these spaces, being able to use as an office or Murphy bed. And then that's the last image of the backside, and you can see the relationship to these trees and how the house shifts. Part of that swerve is to move out of the way of the house, but it also became this amazing just natural shading and cooling for the house. We didn't have to wait many, many years for these trees to grow. We basically let the house negotiate around the trees. That's it. And on the right-hand side, if you want to buy the book at a 20% discount, you can scan that on your phone. Thank you very much.